The conference room smelled like money, citrus polish and old leather, and Daniel Reyes stood at the far end of the table, the only man in the room without a tailored jacket, the only man whose hands had calluses from a decade of writing code at 3 in the morning. Across from him sat the Whitfields. 5 of them, arranged like a jury that had already reached its verdict before the trial began. At the center, Gerald Whitfield, silver-haired and unhurried, slid a folder across the polished surface without lifting his eyes. $750 million, Mr. Reyes. Full acquisition, contingent on immediate transfer of operational control. The number hung in the air the way smoke hangs in a closed room, visible, suffocating, impossible to ignore. Daniel had grown up in a 2-bedroom rental in Tulsa, the kind of place where the heat worked half the winter if you were lucky. $750 million was not a number his childhood had ever taught him to imagine. But he turned the page anyway, and that was when the real offer revealed itself, buried under 3 paragraphs of careful legal language. They weren't buying his company. They were buying his silence. He'd keep his name on the door and lose every key to the building. Gerald leaned back, fingers steepled, studying Daniel the way a man studies a used car he's already decided to lowball. "What you built is clever," he said. "But clever isn't the same as lasting. Men like you find one good idea, and smart men sell before the idea finds them out." A soft laugh moved around the table, not loud, just enough to land. Beside Gerald, his daughter Camille watched without smiling, her eyes moving over Daniel like she was pricing him by the pound. Daniel felt something tighten low in his chest, not anger exactly, more like the particular exhaustion of being underestimated by people who had never once had to prove anything to survive. He thought about the nights he'd coded with his daughter sleeping on the couch beside his desk because the babysitter canceled and the deadline didn't care. He thought about how close he'd come to losing everything more than once. And without meaning to, his hand drifted into his pocket and found his phone. The screen lit up on its own, a photo from 2 weeks ago. His daughter, 8 years old, missing one front tooth, grinning at the camera with chocolate still on her chin, completely unaware that the world had any other shape than the one she lived in. Something in Daniel went quiet and still. He closed the folder. The sound of it was small, but it cut clean through the room and every head turned. He slid it back across the table, his voice even, unhurried, but carrying weight none of them expected. "Then you're not buying my company," he said, looking directly at Gerald. "You're asking me to sell the only reason I built it." For the first time since he'd walked in, the room didn't feel like it belonged to the Whitfields anymore. He didn't look back as he left the building. Outside, the late afternoon traffic of downtown Chicago rolled past indifferent to the fact that a man had just turned away $750 million. He stood on the curb a moment, letting the noise settle into him, before his phone buzzed. A text from his daughter's school, a reminder about the parent meeting Thursday. Just like that, the boardroom shrank down to something small and far away. He drove to the apartment they'd lived in for 4 years, the one above the laundromat where the dryers hummed through the floor at night like a heartbeat. When he opened the door, the smell of crayons and peanut butter hit him before anything else, and his daughter, Lily, looked up from the rug where she was sprawled with a coloring book, and her whole face opened like a window. "Daddy!" She crashed into him before he'd even set his bag down, and Daniel lifted her, the weight of her solid and real against everything that had happened that afternoon. "Hey, Bug." He kissed the top of her head. She pulled back to study his face the way she always did, like she was checking a forecast. "You look tired." "Big meeting," he said simply. She didn't need contracts or control clauses. She needed him to be there, and he was. She nodded like that, explained everything, then grabbed his hand and dragged him to the rug. "Look what I made." It wasn't just a drawing. It was a story. A tall building, a stick figure, holding a smaller stick figure's hand, both grinning too wide to be realistic. Above them, in crooked, determined letters, "My dad builds things." Daniel's throat tightened in a way no boardroom had ever managed. "This is perfect," he said quietly. "You always build things," Lily said, leaning into his side, "even when they break." That was the version of him she carried. Not a CEO under siege, not a man being appraised by billionaires, but someone who fixed what mattered, and that was when the doubt crept back in, sharper now. Maybe walking away hadn't been brave. Maybe it had just been stubborn, and stubborn people didn't survive in a world that rewarded the practical over the principled. His phone buzzed again. This time it didn't stop. Messages stacked on top of each other from his team. "Did you actually turn it down? Tell me this isn't real. Call me the second you see this." Lily noticed the change in his face before he said a word. Her small hand landed on his arm. "Is it bad?" He looked at her, really looked, and understood she wasn't asking for facts. She was asking if it was safe to feel okay. So he set the phone face down and pulled her closer. "No," he said, steadier than he felt. "It's just a lot." She accepted that the way kids accept things when they trust you completely, then picked up a crayon and added something new to the drawing, a circle, drawn carefully around both figures, enclosing them. "That's our bubble," she explained. "Nothing bad gets in." Daniel let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding. That night, after dinner, dishes sat drying in the rack and Lily had fallen asleep against his arm on the couch, he scrolled through the wreckage on his phone. Investors questioning his judgment, a blog post already speculating about his mental state, and one message from a number he didn't recognize. "You just made the worst mistake of your career." Maybe they were right. The Whitfields didn't lose. Everyone in the industry knew that. They didn't get outmaneuvered. They crushed whatever stood in their way slowly until it stopped being a story anyone wanted to repeat. Daniel looked down at Lily's hand, still curled into his shirt even in sleep, and understood with total clarity that whatever came next, he'd face it the way he'd faced everything else. Not chasing approval, but protecting the only thing that had ever made any of it worth doing. He hadn't walked away from something. He'd finally chosen what to stand for, even if it meant the real fight hadn't started yet. The silence the next morning at the office was the loud kind, the kind that follows impact, not the kind that comes from peace. People glanced away when Daniel walked past. Conversations stopped half a beat too late to seem natural. Everyone already knew. Some admired what he'd done quietly. The way you admire something you'd never have the nerve to do yourself. Others thought he'd lost his mind. By the time he reached the conference room, his core team was already seated, and the tension was thick enough to taste. His CFO, Marcus, leaned forward, hands clasped so tight his knuckles had gone pale. "Tell me this isn't final. Tell me there's still a door open." Daniel didn't sit right away. He looked around the table at people who had given up weekends, who had believed in something before it existed, and who were now looking at him like he'd gambled their lives without asking. "It's final," he said. The reaction wasn't loud. It was worse, a quiet, settling kind of disappointment. One of the engineers, Priya, exhaled hard and looked away. "Do you have any idea what that money could have done for us?" He did know. It could have bought them runway, stability, room to breathe. But it would have cost them the only thing that mattered more than survival, the right to decide what they became. Marcus pressed harder. "This isn't only your call, Daniel. There are families depending on paychecks here." The weight of that landed harder than anything Gerald Whitfield had said across that polished table, because this wasn't an enemy trying to break him. This was his own people, doubting him. And still he didn't back down. "I didn't walk away from an opportunity," he said quietly. "I walked away from losing this company before it ever really started." A few faces shifted from anger toward confusion. He kept going. They weren't investing. They were taking. Every decision, every direction, gone. Marcus frowned, and now it might not exist at all. Daniel didn't argue because it was true. The risk was real, the margin gone. That was when his phone buzzed with a message that confirmed exactly what he'd feared. A major partner withdrawing from a pending agreement. No real explanation given. Just the polished language companies use when they've been told to step back quietly. The Whitfields had already started. One by one, more notifications rolled in around the table. Delays, cancellations, sudden reviews nobody had requested a week ago. The room went heavier as people checked their own phones and found the same pattern repeating. Marcus looked up slowly. "They're coming for us!" "I know," Daniel said. Nobody spoke for a long moment because this wasn't theory anymore. It was happening quiet and methodical, and the worst part was how little they could do to stop it directly. The Whitfields didn't need to attack. They just needed to apply pressure in the right places and let the system do the rest. Daniel could see the unspoken question on every face in the room. Was it worth it? He didn't have an answer ready. The silence stretched longer than it should have before he finally said, "Give me 48 hours. If I can't stabilize this, we revisit everything." Marcus held his gaze a long moment, weighing trust against fear before nodding. 48 hours. When the meeting broke, Daniel stayed behind in the empty room, feeling for the first time the full size of what he'd taken on. Not as a statement, but as a responsibility that could define him or end everything he'd spent years building. That night, Lily was waiting at the kitchen table with homework spread out, and she looked up the second she heard the door. "You're late," she said, not accusing, just noting it. "I know." He set his bag down and knelt beside her chair. She studied his face the way she always did, then slid a worksheet toward him. "I did the math ones." He glanced at the page, focusing on it like it was the most important document he'd see all week, because in that moment it was. "Looks like you're getting smarter than me." She grinned, pleased, then hesitated. "Did your meeting go good?" The question carried more weight than anything his board had asked him in 2 days. He chose the truth she could hold without it crushing her. "It was hard," he said honestly, but gently. She nodded like that made perfect sense, then picked up a crayon. Hard things are okay, she said quietly, almost to herself. Daniel felt something settle in his chest. Not relief exactly, just steadiness. Out in the world, success was measured in deals closed and leverage gained. Here, at this small table, it was measured differently, in honesty, in showing up tired but present. Later, after she'd fallen asleep, he opened his laptop and pulled up a set of files he'd kept hidden from almost everyone on his team. The decision in that boardroom hadn't been the end of anything. It had been the opening move. And now, with the clock running and no margin left for hesitation, he had to prove that walking away hadn't been reckless. It had been necessary. The email arrived at 5:14 in the morning, no warning, no urgency in the subject line. Just a quiet notification while the city outside was still gray and half asleep. Daniel was already at the kitchen table with cold coffee and a spreadsheet of numbers that no longer made sense. Burn rate climbing, investor confidence sliding faster than anyone wanted to admit out loud. The sender read Whitfield Capital. The subject line read Final Notice. He read through it slowly. Acquisitions quietly blocked. Partnerships delayed without cause. A regulatory review suddenly reopened on a filing that had been closed for years. Nothing illegal. Nothing that would ever show up as a single dramatic headline. Just steady, deliberate suffocation dressed up as coincidence. And at the very bottom, one line colder than the rest. We trust you'll reconsider your position. It wasn't a request. It was a warning dressed as patience. A reminder that walking away from people like the Whitfields always came with a price. By the time Lily wandered into the kitchen rubbing sleep from her eyes and asking for pancakes like the world couldn't possibly be falling apart, Daniel had already made a decision. Not surrender, something harder. He would fight, not with anger, but with precision. If the Whitfields wanted a war over control, he'd remind them exactly why they'd come looking for him in the first place. 3 hours later, his own conference room looked different from the one he'd walked out of days before. Smaller, plainer, but charged with the same kind of tension. His team sat around the table, tired-eyed, voices clipped. Marcus broke the silence first. "We're running out of room, Daniel. If this keeps going, we won't have leverage left to negotiate anything." Across the table, Priya added quietly, "They're choking us out." Daniel nodded once, acknowledging it, then stepped forward and planted both hands on the table, looking at each of them. Not as employees anymore, but as people who'd trusted him with their futures. "Then we stop reacting," he said, "and we start moving." Confusion flickered across a few faces, but he didn't wait for it to clear. The plan had been forming in his head for days, not out of panic, but out of clarity. The Whitfields believed they understood his limits. What they didn't understand was what he'd actually built. Not just a product, but a predictive system capable of catching security threats and market shifts before they happened, with a level of precision nobody else in the industry had matched. He'd only ever shown the world a fraction of it, holding back until the foundation underneath was strong enough to survive scrutiny. Now the foundation was about to be tested. Over the next 48 hours, everything moved with a kind of focused speed that left no room for doubt. Calls to contacts he'd kept quiet for years, agreements drafted in encrypted threads, meetings held behind closed doors with no press, no investors, and certainly no Whitfields in the room. By the time the sun came up on the third day, something had already shifted in the industry's quiet undertone. Rumors, speculation that Daniel Reyes wasn't just standing his ground. He was preparing something. When the formal request arrived from Whitfield Capital asking for a final conversation, the tone had changed. Still controlled, no longer dismissive. Daniel walked back into that same glass-walled room where everything had started. This time he didn't stand at the end of the table. He sat down uninvited, but no one questioned it. Power, he'd learned, didn't always need to announce itself. Sometimes it just took a seat and waited. When the Whitfields filed in, their expressions were carefully composed, but the air in the room had a different weight to it now. The kind that exists when both sides understand something has shifted and neither wants to be the first to say it. Camille broke the silence. "You've been busy," she said. "Not a question." "So have you," Daniel replied with the faintest controlled smile. The exchange was brief, but it carried more weight than the entire first meeting, because this wasn't about evaluation anymore. It was about position. Without waiting, Daniel reached into his bag and slid a thin folder across the table. "You wanted to buy my company," he said, "but you never understood what you were buying." As the pages turned, the shift in the room became visible. Not loud, just undeniable. This wasn't a product update. It was a blueprint, fully realized, backed by partnerships that hadn't needed Whitfield approval to come together. Gerald leaned forward, flipping through the documents, his expression tightening. "This isn't possible," he muttered, mostly to himself. "It already is," Daniel said, meeting his eyes without flinching. For a long moment, nobody spoke, because the dynamic in the room had fully reversed. Not because Daniel had more money, because he had something they couldn't replicate and couldn't control. Camille closed the folder slowly, her eyes lifting to meet his, calculation replacing certainty. What do you want? Daniel didn't answer right away. He let the question sit there long enough for them to feel its weight, long enough to understand this wasn't a negotiation anymore. It was a decision, and it was his. Respect, he said finally, his voice calm and unshakable, and full control over what I built. Something flickered across Camille's face, not agreement, not yet, but recognition. For the first time, they weren't the ones setting the terms. Gerald exhaled slowly, leaning back, studying Daniel with a different kind of attention now, not as a target, but as a variable he'd badly miscalculated. You're making this harder than it needs to be. No, Daniel said. I'm making it exactly what it should be. The room went still, the truth of it settling over everyone present. The Whitfields hadn't lost control in one dramatic moment. They'd lost it the second they assumed a man like Daniel Reyes could be bought outright instead of understood. When the meeting ended, there was no signed contract, no formal deal, just a quiet, undeniable shift in the air as Daniel stood to leave. This time, nobody laughed, nobody dismissed him. As his hand reached the door, Camille's voice stopped him, Sofnivore. Mr. Reyes. When he turned, her expression had changed, composed but with something new behind it. We'll be in touch. He nodded once, not as someone seeking approval, but as an equal closing out a conversation that had fundamentally changed shape. The headlines didn't disappear overnight, but they softened, shifting from shock to something closer to admiration, the story moving past boardrooms and investor newsletters into something more humans. Not a man who turned down $750 million, but a father who refused to lose himself chasing it. In the weeks that followed, the pressure that had once threatened to crush his company began turning into something else entirely. Quiet respect from partners who'd watched from a distance. New opportunities from people who valued vision over control. The company he'd built on his own terms grew steadier than it ever could have under someone else's name. None of it felt as real to Daniel as the quiet evenings at home, where success wasn't counted in numbers but in presence, in Lily sitting beside him with her crayons while he worked, looking up every so often just to check he was still there. He always was. That had become his definition of success, not growth at any cost, but building something that never pulled him away from the person who mattered most. One evening, with the city lights flickering on beyond the window, Lily climbed onto the couch holding the same drawing. A little more worn now, but still bright. She placed it carefully in his hands. Did your big meeting work? She asked, her voice quiet and curious. Daniel looked down at the drawing, at the two small figures inside the circle she'd called their bubble, and he smiled. Not the kind of smile he used in boardrooms, but something steadier, something that came from somewhere deeper. Yeah, he said softly, pulling her close. It worked. She nodded satisfied and rested her head against his shoulder, her breathing slowing as the night settled around them. Daniel sat there a long while without moving, the noise of the city outside fading into something distant and unimportant, because for the first time he understood, completely and without doubt, that success was never about how much a person could gain. It was about how much of himself he managed to keep. He hadn't walked away from $750 million. He'd walked towards something no contract could ever touch. The right to remain exactly who he was, and the certainty that his daughter would never have to wonder whether her father had traded meaning for money, because he hadn't. And he never would.